There we go. And let's pray together. God, we thank you for bringing us together tonight. We thank you for the gradually changing seasons. We thank you for the ways that you continue to bless us as a small community within our larger church. Be with us tonight as we study these next few verses, as we look at what you want for us to understand and to know and to grow in our own lives. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So just a more truncated review this time, but I always do like to start off by saying, why do we do this? Why do we take this hour and study the Bible? And we do this to record God's interaction with His human creation. I listened to a really interesting podcast today on the development of the idea of the authority of the Bible, and it was fascinating because it's this idea of the authority of the Bible is relatively late in Old Testament development. And here's what I mean. Before the exiles, God's people read the scriptures, and they read them as a way of unifying themselves as a community and understanding their responsibilities as covenant people. But it wasn't until after the exile that the idea that the Bible had some sort of community authority in and of itself as a document that developed. Now that's a long time ago from where we sit now, but when you see it in context, it's relatively later in the development of the Old Testament. And here's the example. Nehemiah 8 is the very first place that's recorded in the Bible where somebody says, I'm going to read the Torah now, you should all stand up. And Nehemiah 8, as we know from the Bible class last year, is after the exile. It's like I said, it's still a long time ago, but it's the 4th or 5th century BC as opposed to the 15th century BC. And so we study the Bible to kind of enter into that relationship with the scriptures and to see what it has to say for us. We also read the Bible for comfort, and that's a lovely and really effective way to read parts of the Bible. But mostly, and this part I want to remind us each week, is that we read the Bible to get a glimpse into the heart of God. We read the Bible so that we can start to conform our lives to God and start to care about what God cares about and weep about what God weeps about and rejoice in things that make God rejoice. It's in this written record of God's interaction with humanity that we get that glimpse. And so, having said that, this is no news to any of you who've been here for the last couple of weeks. Ecclesiastes is not an easy book. It's not an easy book to read. It's not an easy book to sort of pick apart. But I'm really glad it's in the Bible. It may say things that none of the other 65 books say. And it says things that tap into the modern questions that we ask, like about death and isolation and our identity, and what does it mean to be a free person? And what does it mean to have meaning in our lives? What does it mean to have a life of meaning? And Ecclesiastes talks about all 5 of these. And so just as a trajectory, the themes in Ecclesiastes that we're focusing on are this idea of the frustration of with a lack of fairness in the world. Certainly we have seen that. In any other month out of the year, we would all be talking about how to send aid to Afghanistan, who just suffered through not 1, but 2 devastating earthquakes. They just had the bad luck to do it and experience that while the Ukraine war is heating up, while there was a major attack on soldiers in training in Syria, and then Israel-Palestine blew up. So I still have yet to see a single appeal online for Afghanistan, which is a shame. But we struggle with the lack of fairness in the world, and that's a theme uh, in Ecclesiastes, and that's connected to the second theme, which is disappointment with God. I think the idea that a book encourages us and gives us language to express our disappointment with God, I find that to be a blessing. Because anybody who has lived for a while, and as I look around the screen, I'll just say gently, we've all lived a while. That anybody who's lived a while and lived the life of faith for a while has experienced disappointment with God. And I think that's something that we don't often give ourselves room to talk about. And then finally, the main theme is the awareness of our mortality. This idea that life is finite, and that we can't know what's going to happen afterwards in the same way that we know other things. We can believe and we can trust, but we can't know it in the same way that I know where I'm going to be, that I'm going to be having dinner at the end of this class. There are certain things I know because I know them. I'm experiencing them in a physical way right now. We don't get to know what happens after we die. And that's a huge source of frustration for the writer, for the speaker in Ecclesiastes. One last part for introduction, because I think this will always be important for us to orient ourselves as we look at Ecclesiastes. That's that Ecclesiastes is part of the wisdom literature. It doesn't tell history, and it's not poetry. You won't find any worship language in Ecclesiastes. It's not those kinds of writings. It's a particular kind of writing that talks about what life is like in covenant relationship to God and with each other. The wisdom literature is meant to do that. It's meant to say, here's a little slice of real life. And this is what it means to live in relationships that reflect God's covenants with us, and the ways that he wants for us to treat each other. And so Ruth was like that. Proverbs is like that. Parts of the Psalms are like that. Lamentation. Some of the other writings are about, here's what it's like to live in this covenant that God talks about in the other big books that have big words and stories to talk about the covenant. And so usually wisdom literature talks about how the covenant works in our lives. And Ecclesiastes kind of boldly talks about how the covenant doesn't work sometimes in everyday life. It gives us language to be able to talk about that. And so Ecclesiastes turns the wisdom literature on its head by saying that sometimes none of this works. But still, at the end, and we'll see this when we get to chapter 12, heaven knows when we'll get there, but when we get to chapter 12, we're going to see that still the writer says, fear God and keep God's commandments. That is the whole duty of everyone. It's the whole duty, but it's also what makes us whole. And so I'm condensing that intro each time. It'll get shorter and shorter, but some of those things are important to remind us as we get in to the text here. Last week we finished the prologue, and I do want to review just a little bit of that, because it starts with the book starts with this person being introduced by a third person narrator. And the word that they use, usually in most of your Bibles, will get translated to teacher or preacher. But I'm starting to think, I'm convinced now that this is that Kohelet which is the word that gets translated to preacher or teacher. Oddly enough, in Hebrew, it doesn't mean preacher or teacher, but it ends up being translated that way, partly out of tradition. The word, it comes from a root word that means to gather or to assemble or to collect. And so in one way, the teacher that is in Ecclesiastes is gathering people to listen. But what he's sharing with them, what he wants them to hear, is this collection of wisdom that he's gathered together. So there's even a double meaning in the name. But Kohelet, I'm starting to be convinced is a proper name, and it's one of those virtue names, like we saw in Puritan times, where chastity or reads her Bible well. What an awful first name that would be. There are all these kinds of names that we're aware that we know from other places are names that have to do with the thing that identifies us as who we are. And so we're most of tonight we're going to talk about who the writer is and who the writer is not. So I'll set that aside for just a moment. But he gives away the whole point of the book. The narrator does right at the beginning. He says, "Meaningless, meaningless," says Kohelet. Utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. And that's the main point of the book of Ecclesiastes. The prologue introduces a question that we'll see throughout the rest of the 11 chapters or so, and that is, what do we gain from all the work that we do? Now, you might say, if I work hard, I'll have more crops, or if I make more stuff, the business school term is widgets, right? If I make more widgets and I sell them to more people, I'll make more money. That's not what the writer means. When the writer says, what do we profit from all this? The writer is thinking about lifespan as a currency. Like, here I get all of life figured out, but it didn't make my life any longer. So it's a quantity question. We might say that, wow, the pursuit of wisdom is a quality of life question. The speaker in this book disagrees with you vehemently. And so the currency, I think that's the part that we want to know. The currency that he's saying, we don't profit anything from doing this, is it didn't make my life any longer to know, to acquire wisdom and to learn something of how life works. And so part of the lesson here is that very little about our existence is under our control. And the same is true for the earth. We saw through the prologue. Part of it, he starts out with, I don't get to control anything, but he also says, even the earth is stuck in this endless cycle of, the sun rises and sets, and then it runs underneath the earth to rise again the next morning. Just does this over and over. It doesn't prolong anything. It doesn't make its own life better. And rivers run to the sea. We saw all these things last week. Even creation plays a part in this meaningless story, this fruitless story. And just to underline that, he talks about everything we see and hear as part of this pointless mess. And then the prologue said something that we talked about last week that I find a little bit heartbreaking. In verse 11, he says, "No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them." The example I used last week, and maybe a lot of you went to your genealogy books in the week since, but not everybody can name all four of their grandparents. Very few people can name all, it's 8, right? Great grandparents. Is it doubled? Yeah, it's doubled. So, and virtually no one can name all 16 of their great grandparents. Those are people in our families. He's saying, so many people go and come, and yet as soon as they're gone, they're forgotten. We know that's not exactly true, but you get the idea. Even in our own families, if we can't remember our great grandparents' names, those are our flesh and blood, and we don't remember them. What hope do they have of being remembered by anybody else? Kohelet is lamenting that no matter how famous or revered or accomplished he is in his lifetime, it won't be long before people forget about him too. And that ends the prologue from the third person narrator. Sometimes we'll refer to him as the frame narrator, because he frames the whole book. He's at the beginning and he's at the end. And in the next verses, we get to hear from Kohelet himself. And it gives us another chance to talk about who the speaker is in the book. Like I said, Kohelet usually gets translated as preacher or teacher, as an office or a title. And more recently, scholars have been talking about Kohelet as a proper name, like I said before, a virtue name. And it's the name for the speaker in this particular kind of writing that is going to share all this wisdom in the interior chapters, the 11 chapters in the middle of this book. And it starts with, I, Kohelet, I, this person. I like this explanation from Peter Enns, who is my favorite go-to guy on Ecclesiastes. He said, such an announcement reflects a certain kind of literature that was common in the ancient Near East. And it was called a royal testament. So here's what would happen and when they talk about ancient Near East, they're talking about Bible people in Bible times. Old Testament people in Bible times. It's not the Far East, right? It's not the Middle East. It's the Near East. It's that whole region there, which would extend out to what we call the Middle East and inland. There was a kind of writing back then called a royal testament, and oftentimes it would be written to honor a king. Anybody here come from academic life? When a longtime beloved professor retires, oftentimes they do something called a Festschrift. And a Festschrift literally in German means celebratory writing. And it's a bunch of scholars in the same area as the one that's being honored, submitting articles about that area of academic work. And they're collected and published, and oftentimes they say on the front, essays in honor of Professor this person on the occasion of their retirement. This royal testament idea in ancient times is like that. A king might reign for a while and then have somebody write and collect all the wisdom that was collected during their reign and present it in the king's voice. That's what Ecclesiastes is. It's using that model, only instead of, even though he refers to himself as a king a bunch of times, instead of just all the royal wisdom that was collected, what the writer is talking about is all the wisdom about the life of faith that has been collected over the exile and before. So he starts with, I, Kohelet, and the Kohelet turns the royal this royal testament on its head, because he's not going to talk about how great it is to be wise. He's going to talk about how miserable it's made him. He's not going to glorify himself, which was the point of when a king did it. He's going to say, look, I did this. I collected all the wisdom that was available from anywhere, and it didn't get me anything. I don't get a double lifespan out of this, or even half again in my lifespan. And so Kohelet uses that form to turn all of that kind of wisdom seeking on its head. There is no self-glorification going on in Ecclesiastes. Even when the speaker says, look what I did, I learned everything, I sought after the highest wisdom, in the next line he'll say, and it was meaningless. So just to keep circling on that, who is Kohelet? In verse 12, he calls himself a king over Israel in Jerusalem. Now, that's not one to write down because he's not a king. At the time that this was written, he couldn't have been a king looking back over all these years in Jerusalem. At least he couldn't have been Solomon, because there were only two kings ever of Israel that sat in Jerusalem. First David and then Solomon. So the idea that Solomon would write, say, I'm looking back on all these years and generations and all these different reigns in Jerusalem, that's just not the case. It couldn't have been. And then we said in the beginning, in the introduction a few weeks ago, that there are a lot of phrases and stories and styles in Ecclesiastes, even words that came out of exile. So we know it's not written before exile, it's written after the exile. So it wasn't uncommon for writers in the ancient days to write from the idea of a school of thought. And if that sounds like, well, gosh, we don't do that, all kinds of people that happens in all kinds of ways. Now, one example I found today was that there's a school of Zen Buddhism that's named after a town in Japan. Rinzai. Rinzai is one of the three sects of Zen Buddhism. It's named after a town where it was created in the 12th century. But people who write in that tradition even now name themselves after that town. Does that make sense? People take on a persona or a place, and they say they write that way. There is a Chicago School of Economics. It's a very conservative school of economics. Some of the people who write from the point of view of the school of the Chicago School don't live in Chicago. Maybe some of them never been to Chicago. But they write in that tradition, and so they're named for that tradition. Kohelet is a character who speaks from a particular tradition of Hebrew philosophy and faith, and the writer uses the name not to describe a person, but to give a name to a person. In other words, it's not teacher, it's Kohelet, like Joe or Jim or George. And so it's in this persona, as it's in this character as Kohelet, that he writes the rest of the book, all the way to the 12th chapter when the narrator starts back in. And so let's look at the rest of the verses. In verse 13, Kohelet says, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. So right there, he's saying this is the character that is being written about in this book, somebody who tries to understand everything that happens under the sun in the heavens. And then in the same verse, what a heavy burden God has laid on humankind. That's the next line. That phrase that we see as I applied my mind is actually I gave my heart in Hebrew. I gave my heart to this. This isn't somebody getting into cold, precise study. This is not some sort of scholar who tucked themselves away just to learn the details of philosophy. This person gave his heart to trying to learn all of this philosophy, hoping that it would add to his years, hoping that it would give those years more meaning. And so this idea that God has given this heavy burden to all of us, literally, it's a preoccupation with trying to understand what the world is and how it works. The funny thing is we hear that and we think, oh, that's like that's the pursuit of knowledge. And it's what, we're in a college town. There are all kinds of professors here who have devoted themselves to this pursuit of knowledge. But The way Kohelet talks about it, it's this pursuit of knowledge in the hopes that it would expand his lifespan, that it would expand his years. And it's not going to do that. And almost instantly, he blames God for this. What a heavy burden God has laid on humankind. It's God who is responsible for all of this searching. Is it worth the effort? You might already know from what we've done already what the answer to that's going to be. Because that's what makes the next verse so hard to hear. Kohelet, in the very next verse, verse 14, says, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, and all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Chasing after the wind. Anybody here ever chase the wind? Anybody ever catch it? What'd you do with it once you caught it? Now you can catch it as a hang glider. I get that technicality, or in the sail of a ship, you do catch the wind, but you don't really have the wind. And so he likens his pursuit of wisdom to chasing after the wind, which to me is very sad. There are a couple places in here where I get caught up short. The one about generations coming and going, or going and coming, actually. And then this one, we're back to this idea. We're back to the idea that all of this wisdom doesn't profit us at all, at least not in the way that Kohelet was looking for. We'll get reminded later in the book that this is not an attack on trying to live out the covenants. It's not an outsider's attack. It's really the frustrations and the lament of somebody inside the covenant who believes in God and who trusts God, but who's struggling to see the point in covenant life. In other words, the covenant as it's expressed is, if you do this, God will do this other thing for you. And Kohelet is realizing it's not that simple. You know, I could live out all of the principles of the covenant, and there could still be an accident that takes someone near to me. I could fall down and hurt myself, literally coming out of the temple. There is no magic to this. If you were with us on Sunday, you know that magic is one of the ways we go wrong in faith. When we think that the Christian faith is magic, in other words, we say the right potions. It's not a Harry Potter story. You don't say the right thing with the right accent, and all of a sudden a precise thing happens. And Kohelet's disappointed that that's not the case. He's disappointed that the covenant doesn't work like math, because it doesn't work like math. It works like story. And so Kohelet's trying to see the point in covenant life. And in the next verse, he may be quoting a saying that was known to people back then, but it's just another way of talking about frustration and futility. Verse 15, what is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. In other words, stuff that's bent and wrong or broken in some way, we can't mend those things. And things that are lacking in our lives, sometimes it's hard to quantify those things. We're probably better at that now than they were 2,500 years ago when this was written. But still, you get what he's saying. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. And so we're back to there being nothing new under the sun. Everything's meaningless, like a vapor, and nothing changes. And starting in verse 16, because we're just going to carry that on to the end of the chapter today. In verse 16, Kohelet begins making his case from the position of someone who has studied and collected and reflected on all of the wisdom that's available to him. This is now, he's identified himself. He said, this is what I've done. And so in verse 16, he says, I said to myself, it's like literally, I looked myself in the mirror and I said to myself, look, I've increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. I have applied myself, going into verse 17, I have applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also to madness and to folly. In other words, he's looked at what life, pardon me, what life is like when you have a lot of wisdom and you accumulate all kinds of knowledge, and also when you have no wisdom or when you reject wisdom. So that would be madness and folly. And so he's seen the whole spectrum of this. And his next line is, but I learned that this too is chasing after the wind. This part reminds me of a song lyric from a band called Live, which is probably more my generation than any of y'all's. But there's a verse that goes, now I feel it coming back again like a rolling thunder chasing the wind. Forces pulling from the center of the earth again, I can feel it. But that line of like rolling thunder chasing the wind. And there actually some of the guys in that band had some faith commitment, so it wouldn't surprise me if they had dabbled in some of the lines from Ecclesiastes. And but that idea of chasing the wind, it would have sounded like a funny example in ancient times. Yeah, that guy's what an idiot. He's trying to chase the wind. Like anybody who's had a dog and watched it chase its tail. It is the ultimate entertaining act of futility, right? They rarely catch it. And when they catch it, they don't know what to do with it. So that gets us to the last verse for tonight. And this is the one that I really want for us to wrestle with for a couple moments here and then in our discussion. He says in verse 18, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. That one's tough for me, right? I come from a family of teachers. Education was highly valued in our household, and it's something that's important to me. I think I passed that on to my son. Um, and you may have heard the saying, and I can't remember which philosopher said this, but an unexamined life is not worth living. That is not what Kohelet is saying in this book. He's saying, be careful of how much you examine your life, because at the end of it, you won't have done anything. you won't have gained anything. There would be no profit from doing that. No extension of your lifespan. Kohelet seems to be saying the opposite of what we probably said, which is we got to get as much education as we can. But here's the thing. I think there's a little bit of wisdom, which makes sense, right, from the wisdom literature. But I think there's something for us to remember from here, because it's not just about education. I don't think he's criticizing education. I think he's criticizing obsessing over our lives. Sometimes obsessing about life can lead to missing out on what life has to offer. Obsessing about life can make us miss out on what life has to offer. Kohelet knows how things are supposed to be. And this book is a collection of teachings where he's trying to figure out what life means when it doesn't work. Kohelet knows the covenants. Kohelet is a person of faith. This is not an outside critic of Judaism or of Hebrew faith. This is somebody who is an insider who's trying to figure out, what do you say when this stuff doesn't work? And so that gets us back to our question at the end of each week, which is, what are we supposed to do about that? And I've been saying that one of the things I appreciate about Ecclesiastes is that all of these struggles and conclusions are things that we think about if we're honest with ourselves. These are things that we all struggle with. You can, there's sayings, right? You know, the navel gazing, right? The whole idea of navel gazing is that you spend so much time looking at yourself, you don't see anything else. And people do that. People obsess about things and they miss what's going on in real time. There are whole chapters in Ecclesiastes where he's going to advise us on how not to do that. But we all think those things, and then we stuff them down because churches don't often make space for people who struggle. Churches don't often make room for somebody who says, I have faith, but if faith is supposed to work, sometimes my faith doesn't work. I'd be surprised if anybody who had been a person of faith for any amount of time didn't have that thought from time to time. Ecclesiastes is there to give us permission to ask those questions and to interrogate God about those things. God's tough enough. God can take these questions. I'm grateful that God gives us that permission and that God isn't going to be angry or somehow defeated or deflated or knocked over by humans asking questions. But in order for us to continue to do this, I say this each week too. Let's hold off. Let's hold off on the part of the story we already know, which is being on this side of the ministry of Christ. You get your money's worth out of Ecclesiastes when you let yourself wallow in Ecclesiastes without looking to the other 65 books to make you feel better. And so next week we're gonna dive into what Kohelet starts to talk about in chapter 2, and I'm gonna break it up into some themes so that we don't try and do 12 chapters, 4 verses at a time. We'll have some other pacing on this, but I think the introduction and completing this part of the introduction has been important. Let me unmute you all.
You just said next week, but you said you were not meeting next week.
You're 100% right. Thank you for sometimes those details don't work either.
And
in 2 weeks.
and there's been discussion on the internet lately about the increase in, quote, narcissism in this generation. And that sounds like exactly what you're describing here.
Well, I think I want to make I'm glad you pointed that out, Roger. I want to make a little bit of a distinction between Kohelet and his obsessive desire to gain knowledge and wisdom about the world, and a narcissist who manipulates other people and sees everyone as a tool of their own sort of pleasures and desires. I do want to make sure that there's a difference there. But maybe I overstated the navel gazing part. I think what Kohelet is talking about is spending your whole life trying to figure out how life works instead of actually living that life.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, Cliff, please. I think I see you're in.
If Kohelet said, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow, who said ignorance is bliss?
Yeah, that's a good one. I did a whole sermon series about 3 churches ago on things that aren't in the Bible that get quoted as if they're in the Bible. Like cleanliness is next to godliness and things like that. Or the worst one of all, God won't give you more than you can handle. Expunge that heresy from your brain and from your life, and you'll be better for it. But yeah, ignorance is bliss. There are places in Ecclesiastes where he makes that sound like that's the case. Like, it's better just not to know how everything works.
Yeah.
It's better just to live your life than to obsess about how life works. So in other words, to use modern terms, when we get caught up in the abstract definitions and workings of life and obsessing over theirs, we miss the actual thing about Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and the friendships we can have and the meals we can enjoy and the love that we can experience and share. In other words, live your life. Don't obsess about trying to figure out how life works. Bert, did I see a hand?
Yes. Well, I'll be a bit of a contrarian. I think this book could have been left out of the Bible. I think we're spending far too much time on chapter 1.
Yes.
Colette is a hopeless cynic and pessimist.
Yes.
He didn't use his knowledge for good or the lot of humankind. He didn't speak anywhere in this first chapter about service.
Nope.
And that's what we think is valuable today.
Yep. That's why this would be a miserable Bible if that was the only book in it.
Absolutely. And, it's just last Monday, Father Desmond was telling us that the church form as we know it is going away. And yet we're working to preserve it. Well, why?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first off, we don't want to accept his premise as 100% true.
True.
And so,
Yeah.
So like a good journalist, you gotta dodge the premise in the answer, and then or in the question.
Do you mean Father Nisbet? Do you mean Father Nisbet?
Yeah, I guess that's who he's talking about. But the idea is, if I'm 60 years old, I got my first Bible when I was 10. This is the first time I've read through Ecclesiastes. So if we take the large view, a couple of weeks or a couple of months of getting sort of hip deep in what Colette has to say is a leavening or a balancing to the way the other books talk about it. You're right. If this is the only book, then we're all sunk. But there's, and there's no pun intended, there's wisdom in this book, and it's coming. But I'll say right now, Bert, it's not the wisdom you're looking for. Anna, and then Susan.
Thanks. My eye keeps straying to verse 15, where it says, "What is crooked cannot be straightened." I'm just so curious, would Luke have read this, and would he have thought about that, about the paths being straightened?
Oh, that's a great question. Certainly Ecclesiastes would have been in the Septuagint, which was the Greek Bible that the New Testament writers would have had access to. The Greek Old Testament for us. Not every first century Jew read Hebrew. Most of the quotes of the Old Testament in the New Testament are from the Greek Old Testament, not the Hebrew Old Testament. And so Luke would, let's put it this way, if Luke's like us, he may never have read it unless he had a rabbi that forced him to for a couple of months in a midweek Bible study. But he had access to it. It was part of the wisdom. It was part of, remember from last year, there's a word, and it's the word is tekuvim. And tekuvim is the Hebrew word that describes what we call the Old Testament. And it's the three kinds of writings. It's Torah, it's Tanakh and, oh shoot, is it Midrash?
I think so. I can't remember.
Whatever it is, it's the law, the prophets, and the writings.
Right. Yeah. Huh?
And so yes, Luke would have had access to this book as a part of the writings. It would have been on a scroll.
Cool.
But harder to find on a scroll and easier to ignore on a scroll.
Kind of like in the back of your garage kind of thing.
Yeah, because you got to roll by. Oh, you roll by the Proverbs. I can see if you're in the scroll, you're going, oh, but there's all these good Proverbs here. We don't even have to get to Ecclesiastes. Susan, please.
Yeah, 2 points. One is I think there is a difference between as education, being educated, being knowledgeable, and wisdom. I think they're different states. And also, my Bible, NIV, says that what he's talking about is humanistic wisdom. That's wisdom without God. So that wisdom without God, if you read that, with much wisdom without God comes much sorrow. So,
yeah. So the NIV has a point of view.
I'm sure.
And that line is the NIV's point of view. Whenever they get to the hard stuff, they say, well, it means this and not this other thing. And matter of fact, so much so that I dropped $100 on a different Bible this week so that I could read notes. I wanted to read critical notes about these texts that didn't have a point of view. And the thing is, wisdom is wrapped up in God's gifts to people. And I think the harder reading is Kohelet's talking about the wisdom he got from God that didn't make his life better, or didn't consistently make his life better, or didn't make his life longer, if we're talking about life as currency. And so, but I can totally see that note in an NIV. It's the notes I have too. Yeah. That you have the study Bible, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And please.
Which Bible did you get?
Oh, I got the New Revised Standard Version. And what I sprung for was the Oxford Annotated version of that, which has introductions and notes that are from a critical scholarship point of view. The faith part's up to me. I want to know what the text actually said and wrestle with the hard part. I don't need to have that part smoothed over.
Right.
And so I keep an NIV study Bible, but I read the NIV study Bible with a little bit of, I know that there's a filter there.
Right.
And that I would imagine for the people at Zondervan who are behind the NIV, Ecclesiastes was a hard book for them.
Thank you.
Does somebody else have something?
That was going to be my question.
Okay.
So thank you for answering.
Yeah. So that the New Revised Standard Version isn't okay, let me back up here. The tension for translating Bibles has a lot of factors to it, but I'll talk about two. One of them is how close you translate the original language. And the other one is how readable it is for people in whatever language it's being translated to. Remember that there's 4 or 5 ancient languages involved in our Bible. And sometimes they use idioms that don't make any sense to us. Just like we have idioms. My mom taught level 1 ESL for 25 years. And she kept a whole list of things that used to make her students scratch their heads that English speaking people say. Keep an eye out for my friend. Really? Or one time she said, shake a leg to get students to hurry. And like they froze. Which leg? How do you want me to shake that leg? So every language has those. Ancient languages are no different. And part of the translation process sometimes is not to translate the idiom as it was then, which wouldn't make any sense to us, but it's to find the equivalent idiom in our language and use that.
Yeah, it seems a little.
And so the NIV, which is still the one I use on Sunday morning because it reads so elegantly. But the one that I study from is the New Revised Standard Version. So you're looking for accurate, for example, the New American Standard Bible, the NASB, which some of you may have. That one is, their higher value was to be more of a literal translation, but I think personally it reads lousy out loud. And so you really, there are competing values because we're all reading something that's a couple of steps away from the original, both in time and in language. And so you sometimes reading it in two translations is good.
Well,
yes, Lois.
I identify with Bert because it seems like the Qoheleth is overly self-reflective, and I like Bert. I've always been curious about stuff. Okay, so lately I've been reading books about the macro world and the micro world. Curveball by Peter Epps, and also The Physics of God by Joseph Selby. And when I look at that quantum world, or when I look at the astronomical world, it's so much better, as Peter Epps says, it's so much bigger. It amazes me.
Yeah.
But that's looking at it differently. And also, I have to come back to finding meaning in life. I think, of course, that's different from Ecclesiastes, but I think it's our role, I think, to find meaning in life.
Definitely.
Reality.
Yeah.
Reality.
So maybe one of the things that you guys are all identifying is something we should have in our minds as we read the rest of this book, is that Qoheleth's mistake isn't in his conclusions, it's in the questions that he asked at the beginning. Why he spent all that time chasing wisdom, thinking it would expand his life rather than just living life. Because the advice he gives is don't do what I did. That's a sub point. If we're looking for what are the ethics of Ecclesiastes, one of them is don't do it my way.
Yes, but as Jack said, we all have this curiosity.
Yeah, it's not knowledge. It's an obsession with trying to understand and maybe even control how the world works. That's Qoheleth's mistake. It's not the accumulation of knowledge. It's the obsession over trying to figure out how the world works and ultimately to manipulate how the world works. The fact that he wants to have a longer life is him wanting to change the rules of the game in the fourth quarter.
Let me throw out another idiom, Jesus idiom. Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves.
Yeah. So, so there's, I think you guys have identified something. This is helping me too. So I think what you've identified is that Qoheleth, it's not that he's getting to the end of his life and saying, here, do it my way. He's saying, don't do it my way. do not obsess so much on how to control the world and
Yeah.
miss out on living your life, because this life is the only
Living it.
valuable life you get.
Yep.
And so to me, I don't want to try and shine the apple too much, especially if it's, well, anyway, if it's not an apple at all. But it's I think this is the hopeful part of Ecclesiastes, is do as I say, not as I do. This way that I've done it has led to me being in the last chapter of my life and thinking I wasted so many good years trying to figure out how all this works without actually living their life, living life. And so I think that's what Coelette's trying to get at. That whoever wrote this and wrote it from the point of view of this wisdom seeker is saying, relax. There will be places that we come up on in the next couple of weeks where he says, just eat good food and have celebrations with people and chill out.
Well, isn't that a good thing?
It is a good
right
thing.
now- well, because right now everything seems pretty crazy to me, and
Yeah.
it can be crazy.
Yeah.
So is he saying not to be crazy?
He's saying not to be crazy. I obsess over world events, and there are people that are dear to me who are in the West Bank that are caught up in what might end up being a secondary part of this conflict. I have friends who have dear friends in Gaza. I have a friend that I went to seminary with who was a Christian minister in Gaza. And so I'm wrapped up in this story. But it doesn't mean I'm not going to have lunch with my wife today. It doesn't mean I don't get to pause and turn the TV off and study for this class tonight. Or to turn the TV on, but not on the news, but on a baseball game. You know what I mean? Some of this is about figuring out how to have a more balanced life. Because in the end, what Colette is saying is, I didn't live a balanced life. I obsessed over the accumulation of, and when he says wisdom, it's figuring out how the world works and then trying to manipulate how the world works. And it didn't work. It didn't work for him.
Well, as you know, Paulilo's daughter-in-law's family had to escape Ukraine, and we were even there when they did.
Yeah.
Last year.
Yeah.
And we were just with all these people.
Yeah.
And,
So there's enough. So last quote I'll give you is one of my favorite quotes from a romantic poet, from William Wordsworth. Has a poem where he says, the world is too much with us. And that seems to me to be a wonderful example of secular wisdom literature. If you're going to try and live a life of covenant relationship with God and with each other, don't let the world intrude too much on that. So I'll leave you with Wordsworth because he's a better poet than me. So we're off next week. We'll be back the next week. Let me just ask you to give all of chapter 2 a good close read over the next couple of weeks. Read it a few times. And then maybe it'll be less of me just saying the same meaningless things over and over again. And we'll have a little bit more discussion time next time. But I will see you on Sunday and then see you again here in 2 weeks. Let me close us in prayer. God, thanks for this book, even if it's already irritating us. Thank you for the lessons that it has. I pray that we will hear them and live into them. Thank you for the reminder that that we don't have to figure everything out, and that we get to live these lives that you've given us and enjoy them for what each new day brings. So may that be true for each one of us. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Have a good evening,
Shalom.
and shalom.
Hello.